Join me tonight on Twitch at 11:30 p.m. Eastern after the conclusion of Sunday Night Football, where we'll talk about everything that happened this week in the NFL. And join me Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern to play some live NFL trivia for a chance to win cash prizes. Link in the description below. And now, on with our feature presentation. Throughout the first 30-some-odd years of the history of the Raiders, whether they were playing in Oakland or Los Angeles, it seemed like they had one of the most consistent running games in all of football. No matter who was back there, the player that got the ball was going to make magic happen and torch opposing defenses. From Clem Daniels in the 1960s to Mark Van Egan and Pete Banaszak in the 1970s to Marcus Allen and Bo Jackson in the 1980s, it seemed like there were few jobs in football better than the primary ball carrier on the Raiders. And one of the better ones was this man right here. This is Marv Hubbard. He was an incredible player with Oakland, and throughout the first half of the 1970s was one of the best in football at his position. He made 3 Pro Bowls, had 3 straight seasons with over 1,000 yards from scrimmage, and was a big reason why the Raiders were consistently in the postseason and near the top of the AFC on a yearly basis. But what you might not know is the incredibly bizarre start to his career. Because when his career started off, Hubbard had no idea that he was even under contract by the Raiders. He somewhat accidentally signed a contract to play for the team. And this is the story behind that. Before I talk about the contract in question, we need some context to understand just who Marv Hubbard is, and why the Raiders coveted him so badly in the first place. Our story begins in the mid-1960s, when there was an incredible runner coming out of Colgate by the name of Marv Hubbard. Unsurprisingly, there is no footage of 1960s Colgate football, so what you're watching right now are some highlights from Hubbard's eventual storied NFL career. Even though it's been close to 60 years since Hubbard suited up for the college Raiders, he still holds a special place in school history as one of the greatest players in the history of the institution. I would be here all day if I listed every single accolade and accomplishment won and received by Hubbard in his 3 seasons playing for the school. So here are just some of the highlights. In 1966, he had a 91-yard touchdown run against Boston University, which to this day remains the longest touchdown in school history. By the time he was done playing, he was the all-time leader in school history in rushing yards with 1,887 and in rushing touchdowns with 22. He had a game in 1966 against Rutgers where he ran for 194 yards. At the time, it was the most rushing yards by any player in a game in school history. He had 5 games in his career with at least 100 yards rushing. That was the second most in school history at the time, only trailing Alan Egler, who eventually got drafted by the Los Angeles Rams in the 7th round of the 1950 NFL Draft. In 1966, Colgate went 8-1-1, finishing with the second best record across all 29 independents and their best record since 1932, when they claimed a national championship after not allowing a single point all season. And Hubbard led the way with 13 touchdowns, which was 6th in the entire NCAA and the most in school history in a single season by any player since the end of World War II. He also became the first player since Al Egler from 1948 to 50 to lead Colgate in all-purpose yards in 3 straight seasons. All of this is to say that Hubbard was a really good collegiate player. He was so good, in fact, that the Raiders drafted him in 1968, spending an 11th round pick on him and making him just the 4th Colgate player in the past decade to get drafted. It wouldn't be the last time Oakland would take a running back out of Colgate, as a few years later, they drafted the man that would eventually become Hubbard's successor, Mark Van Egan. If you want to learn more about him and how that went down, which might be the craziest Al Davis draft story of all time, then click the card in the upper right corner. But as most 11th round picks realize, it was going to be a significant uphill climb to make it onto the roster. The deck was completely stacked against Hubbard from day one. For starters, 11th round picks are close to throwaway picks, and are usually meaningless. The year before, in 1967, there were 26 players to get drafted in the 11th round. Of those 26 players, 20 of them, or close to 77%, did not make the roster. And of those 6 players who were lucky enough to make it, 2 of them did not make it past that 1967 campaign. On top of that, if that wasn't bad enough, the Raiders had one of the best running games in all of football the year before, finishing 3rd in the AFL in rushing yards and yards per attempt, and finishing 1st in rushing touchdowns. Finding a way to beat out Hewitt Dixon, Clem Daniels, and Pete Banaszak for a spot on the team, as well as their 4th round running back that they drafted in Charlie Smith, was never going to be easy. As a side note, if you want to learn more about Clem Daniels and his time with the Raiders, then click the card in the upper right corner. And unsurprisingly, Hubbard did not make it onto the roster. A lot of rookies, especially from traditionally smaller schools, struggle to make that adjustment from the college game to the pro game, and Hubbard was no exception at first. He was not a good blocker, primarily because he was never really asked to block at Colgate. Since he was their best player and their best ball carrier, he just got the rock all the time. As Hubbard said on his initial stint with the Raiders, "I didn't have any confidence in myself. I was lost. I didn't know anything about formations. I think we used about 2 of them at Colgate." He never felt comfortable in Oakland, nor did it seem from all the quotes and articles that I could find that he enjoyed the experience. In fact, when Hubbard first got drafted by the Raiders, Hubbard, who lived his whole life in New York up until that point, had no idea where Oakland even was. Hubbard was released by the Raiders, and while he would get picked up by the Denver Broncos, it was more of the same. Even though Denver seemed like a much easier spot to make it than Oakland, since the Broncos were at the bottom of the AFL in a ton of major statistical rushing categories the year before, Hubbard could not crack his way onto the roster. Once again, Hubbard was cut before the start of the season. Usually, you would think that would be the end of the story. A super late draft pick looks out of place at the pro level, fails to do anything of note in training camp at multiple locations, and flames out. But that's where this story takes an absolutely bizarre twist. Because what happened next might be the strangest and most bizarre contract situation in the over 60-year history of the Raiders franchise. Hubbard's next move was to play minor league football, as he played with the Hartford Knights, a brand new team in the Atlantic Coast Football League. Unsurprisingly, once again, there is no footage of Hubbard playing with the Knights, so here are some more highlights from his eventual success with the Raiders. That season, the Knights went 15-1, and won their first title in franchise history after defeating the Virginia Sailors in the championship by a final score of 30-17. And perhaps the biggest reason why the Knights were successful that year was because of the incredible play of the 11th round castaway, Marv Hubbard. He learned how to block. As the lead blocker, he helped Mel Meeks finish with the second most rushing yards in the league. The man who came in first? Marv Hubbard himself. He was a dominant player in every sense of the word, and he increased his weight from 210 to 230, making him even harder to tackle and bring down. He finished the season with 899 rushing yards and an unbelievable 5.6 yards per carry. Unsurprisingly, Hubbard made it onto the All-ACFL team, and was arguably the best player in the entire league. And while this was technically minor league football, teams had affiliations with NFL and AFL teams, so this wasn't some completely random league. In other words, teams were taking notice. They saw a hard-hitting fullback who proved himself in the minor leagues and showed how good he could be. They saw a guy that was well-rounded, that was one of the toughest runners in the sport, and that could help carry a team to a championship. By this point, Hubbard was feeling great. He knew that his stint with the Knights was nothing more than a pit stop, and he expected somewhat of a bidding war for his services. Plenty of teams could use a guy like that. And as the bidding war was about to take place, and as Hubbard realized that he was going to get his chance to play at the highest level there was, Al Davis and the Oakland Raiders swooped in and said, "Not so fast, my friend." Because in an absolutely crazy and bizarre situation, even though the Raiders cut him, Hubbard was still under contract with the Raiders. I know what you're probably thinking, and it's a perfectly valid question if you're scratching your head right now. How do the Raiders still own his rights? How was Hubbard still under contract from the Raiders when the Raiders voided the contract by cutting him? Well, in today's NFL, obviously something like this could not happen for very obvious reasons. But back in 1968, here's how it all went down. When Hubbard signed with the Raiders after getting drafted by them, he signed for 2 years. However, it wasn't a traditional 2-year contract. Instead, it was 2 separate 1-year contracts. What did this mean? It meant that the Raiders owned his rights in 1968 and 1969, but each year was treated separately. Today, if a player signs a 4-year contract and the team decides to cut the player after the 3rd year, that team doesn't own the rights to that player for the 4th year, because the contract was continuous. But with Hubbard's contract, because it was a series of 1-year contracts with each year being its own separate thing, it meant that no matter what the Raiders did in 1968 with him, they would own his rights for the 1969 season. Now usually, this isn't an issue whatsoever. This never comes up, because when a late round pick can't make it past the first few days of camp, the team has no interest in potentially bringing him back later down the road. However, because of what Hubbard did in the ACFL, and because of how strong his performance was and how it intrigued Al Davis, it posed an incredibly unique scenario that the Raiders absolutely took advantage of. Now at first, Hubbard had no idea what was happening. One report said Hubbard thought he would be a free agent and would be able to peddle himself to the highest bidder. He had not had a good experience with Oakland and was eager to move on. To his dismay, Hubbard learned that he had signed 2 1-year contracts with the Raiders and was bound to report to them. Hubbard had no idea what he was getting into. I don't want to say he accidentally signed a contract in the same way that Jim Grabowski did with the Green Bay Packers a few years prior, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But he had no idea that such a scenario was even possible. Dismayed and upset that he would not be able to get the bidding war he desired, and upset that he would still be faced with a stacked backfield and depth chart, Hubbard reluctantly reported to the Raiders. However, I think it's safe to say that when all was said and done, this turned out incredibly, unbelievably well for both sides. Not only did Hubbard make it onto the roster in 1969, finding his way onto the incredibly crowded backfield and looking miles better than he did the previous year at camp in 1968, but he would eventually become one of the best players in the NFL at the fullback position. After playing sporadically over the first 2 seasons, mainly being delegated to special teams duty, by 1971, he was the team's starting fullback. That season, he picked up over 1,000 yards from scrimmage and picked up 867 rushing yards on 4.8 yards per carry. he finished the year 7th in the league in rushing yards and 4th in yards per carry, and was able to make the first Pro Bowl of his career. Fortunately for him, that would be far from his last, because he was just getting started. In 1972, Hubbard had another incredible season, running for 1,100 yards on 5 yards per carry. Not only did he finish the year 5th in rushing yards and 5th in yards per carry, becoming one of just 2 people in the league, alongside Dolphins runner Larry Zonka, to finish the year with at least 1,100 rushing yards and 5 yards per carry, but he made it to the second Pro Bowl of his career as well, and helped guide the Raiders back to the postseason. And in 1973, he did it again, making it to the 3rd straight Pro Bowl of his career after finishing with over 1,000 yards from scrimmage on 4.7 yards per carry. By the time his 7 seasons at Oakland came to an end, he had 4,394 rushing yards and 22 rushing touchdowns, not including a few critical touchdowns and yards that he had in the postseason. He ended his career second in Raiders history at the time in rushing yards, only behind Clem Daniels. For an 11th round pick who was only there because of a technicality, that's pretty good. Today, most Raiders fans remember Marv Hubbard very fondly. They remember him as an absolute wrecking ball that helped propel the offenses of the Raiders in the early 70s to great success. And they remember him as one of the best and most dominant fullbacks of his generation. But as great as his career was, the start to his career, and how he got to Oakland in the first place, is equally incredible. To be cut by the Raiders in 1968 and then think you're a free agent, only for the Raiders to say, "Psych, we still own your rights, and you didn't read the contract," bring him back, and then have him become nothing short of a team legend? It doesn't get a whole lot crazier and stranger than that. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9, and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.